How do we know what is the effect of stress on the developing brain and what is the effect of alcohol? Well, in the case of the kids who've got the facial markings or the brain scan findings or the heart difficulty or heart abnormalities and so on, caused by the toxin, alcohol, well, you can clearly say that's the alcohol. But what about the many kids with the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder who don't have any of the physical markings at all? Can we say for sure that it's all because of the alcohol? Just in this last Sunday's New York Times Magazine, there's actually an article about a kid with FASD and his dog. And this child was adopted from Russia by American parents and brought to the States, and along with the little girl they also adopted, and it became apparent very early that this boy is troubled, tantrums and screaming and inability to learn and behavior issues, and the family's life became a nightmare. Now, the cases of FASD or fetal alcohol disease or the disorder, where it's extreme, you can have actually abnormalities in the kidneys and the face, of course, the thinner lip and the flatter groove here, abnormalities in the brain, in the heart, and so on. The outlook is poor for a lot of these kids, statistically, that is to say, and I'll be hastened to tell you that the outlook does not need to be poor. That it is poor is not simply an outcome of the disorder. That the outlook is so poor for so many of these kids has to do with how we as a society respond to kids who are challenged. And as the New York Times article says, this boy was intellectually impaired and at high risk for a range of secondary disabilities, including poor judgment, impulsive behavior, social isolation, limited academic achievement, unemployment, drug and alcohol abuse, imprisonment, mental health problems, including suicidal ideation, inability to live independently, and inappropriate sexual behavior. Now, of course, as Natalie pointed out, there's lots of other people in our society and lots of other kids who are also at risk for poor impulse control, inappropriate sexual behavior, imprisonment, poor academic achievement, unemployment, and social ostracization. So that's not restricted to the fetal alcohol spectrum. The simple understanding, of course, in North America is that a woman drinks during pregnancy, the kid is damaged by the alcohol, bad woman, poor kid. So that we judge the woman as having done something bad to an unborn child, and then we pity the child, but we have little understanding of what that child actually needs, because we think that the damage is due to the alcohol, and what can you do about it anyway? Now, as always, the simple answer, or the simplistic answer, is not the appropriate answer. And as Natalie indicated in the introduction, there's another way to look at things, which is the only way to understand any human being and any human activity and any human problem, which is to recognize it in context, which is to recognize the connections between people, the connections between phenomena, and the interaction of the individual with the social environment.
Does alcohol really affect unborn baby? What if everything you thought about addiction and pregnancy was wrong? Dr. Gabor Mate reveals the untold truths about fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, showing us why compassion and understanding are the real keys to breaking the cycle. You won't want to miss this eye-opening perspective that challenges everything we think we know about FASD. Did you know that alcohol exposure during pregnancy can cause more than just physical changes in a child? The effects go much deeper, impacting the brain, behavior, and even the next generation. But what if we told you that these outcomes are not set in stone, and that society plays a crucial role in shaping them? Learn how factors beyond genetics, like environment, trauma, and societal responses, profoundly affect those with FASD. We'll also uncover how healing is possible through understanding, compassion, and community support. So, if you're ready to see FASD from a whole new perspective and understand the powerful role of neuroplasticity in recovery, stay tuned. So, what is FASD? Fetal alcohol spectrum disorders refer to a range of conditions that can occur in an individual whose mother consumed alcohol during pregnancy. These disorders are characterized by various physical, behavioral, and cognitive abnormalities, including physical issues, such as distinctive facial features, heart defects, and growth deficiencies. Brain damage, resulting in intellectual disabilities, learning difficulties, poor memory, and difficulty with problem solving and attention. Behavioral problems, including impulsivity, poor judgment, social difficulties, and challenges in adapting to change. FASD is a spectrum, meaning the severity of symptoms can vary widely among individuals. The disorders are not solely determined by alcohol exposure. Factors like the timing, frequency, and amount of alcohol consumed during pregnancy, as well as the mother's overall health and environmental factors, also play a significant role.
We have an interesting situation in Canada. Interesting in a rather tragic way, I should say. In that, of course, in the First Nations communities, the fetal alcohol problem is more prevalent than it is in other parts of society. We also have, by the way, the dubious statistic, I say dubious, morally dubious, but unfortunately true, statistic that a disproportionately large number of people who are addicted come from First Nations backgrounds, and the ones who end up in jail. So that in some of the federal jails in Canada, the majority or close to majority of the inmates are actually of First Nations origin, whereas of course they make up only a small percentage of the Canadian population. In the downtown east side, where I worked for 12 years, about 30% of my clients at least would have been First Nations, whereas again, they only make up 2 or 3% of the Canadian population. And of course we can say, well, you know, that's just a drunken Indian for you. And that's the phrase that we use, isn't it? Now, then we assume that these people are either somehow flawed morally or intellectually. They're just not thinking on their feet, so they drink too much, making a bad choice. Or we might, with a bit more compassion, say, oh geez, it's too bad, genetically they're just predisposed to drink. Poor people, what a shame. But here's the thing that knocks both of those ideas out of the water as soon as you think about it. Before the coming of the Caucasians, there were addictive substances, or substances that were potentially addictive. In North America, there was, of course, tobacco. There was peyote. There were psychedelic plants. And in some areas of North America, there were alcoholic spirits. Not only did these substances exist, they were also known to the natives, and not only were they known to the natives, they were used by them. But how were they used? They were used ceremonially. They were used spiritually. They were used to take the consciousness to a higher level, which is the very opposite of addiction. The essence of addiction is to bring your consciousness to a lower level so that you don't feel what you don't want to feel. So addiction, including drinking, is an escape. The person who drinks doesn't choose, really, to be dependent on alcohol. I'm talking about the people that drink too much. People drink because they don't like how they feel. People actually drink because they don't enjoy the state of their mind, which is to say the state of their brain. It's too uncomfortable for them. So the use of drugs, any mind-altering substance, unless in the exceptional ceremonial context, under the guidance of elders and tradition and ceremony and ritual, except in those circumstances, the use of substances is pretty much always there because you don't like the way you are or feel or think, and you want to change your brain chemistry so that you alter the state of your mind. And so if you want to understand why people want to alter the state of their minds, it's not enough to talk about genetics, is it? If the problem was genetic, and since that there were all these substances here before the coming of the Caucasians, there should have been a lot of addictions in our First Nation population before the colonial arrival. But there wasn't any addiction. Therefore, we know that it can't be genetic. We also can begin to see that it's not a matter of choice, because if it's a matter of choice, why didn't you choose it before? Instead of using these substances ceremonially with respect in healing, like tobacco was a healer. And tobacco is still used by peoples all around the world, in Latin America, for example, as a healing plant. Not as something to escape reality from. So we can understand that our quick judgments about these people somehow made a bad choice, they're stupid, or that they're genetically just susceptible and therefore what can you do? These ideas don't stand up to any kind of scrutiny. And if we actually want to understand why is it that people wish to alter the states of their mind and the chemical balance of their brains through the use of chemicals? We have to ask a simple question. What do the substances do? What do the substances do? Well, basically, what alcohol does is it suppresses one chemical in the brain and enhances another one. And the one that it suppresses is called glutamate, and it's responsible for the excitation of nerve cells in the brain. And the one that it enhances is called GABA, or gamma-aminobutyric acid, GABA, which inhibits, slows things down. So the person who drinks wants to slow things down, wants to uptune themselves, wants to feel numbed out. In fact, what do we say about somebody who's drunk too much? We say, oh, he's feeling no pain. So the urge to drink, especially in high quantities, is actually a desire to get away from pain. And if that is the case, then the question we have to ask is not why the alcohol or why the drug, but why the pain? And now if we understand that question, we can't look at genetics or choices, because nobody chooses to be in pain, and there's no genetic predisposition to pain. What there is people's life experience. In short, the answer to the dilemma of drinking or any other substance use can only come if we examine people's lives. Now, once we start to examine people's lives, of course, we have to look at the larger picture. Because no baby is born independently or could survive independently. Children are born into a culture, they're born into a society, they're born into an economic situation, they're born into a whole set of circumstances which they didn't choose and over which they have no control. So therefore, if you understand the experience of that child, you have to look at the society into which they're born and the history of that society and the current practices and mores and policies of that society. In short, we can't understand anything in isolation. We have to look at the connections. That's not a new idea. And the question we really have to ask is, how do we get from a situation? There was a study last year at Notre Dame University in the States. They looked at which societies are best at parenting. Which are the best societies for rearing children? Now, in recent years, I've been to a lot of First Nations communities across Canada, here in BC as well. And I'm not saying this in any way to blame, as I'll explain. I'm just describing. And what is true, there's a lot of pain and trauma in these communities. And a lot of the pain and the trauma in these communities is inflicted by the adults on the children. Abuse and neglect. And that's not unique to the Native communities. We see it across the board. We see it in other parts of society as well. But it's particularly endemic in Native communities. So when you look at that, it's a bit surprising to find out maybe that in this Notre Dame study, when they looked at the optimal environment for parenting, you know what they found? The optimal environment for parenting is the hunter-gatherer tribe. Which is to say, the society that Native people here had before the coming of the Caucasians. In other words, they had the culture that was best designed to support healthy child development. And there's a number of reasons for that. Like one thing they didn't do is they didn't beat their kids. And when the Caucasians arrived in North America, they were, the British, they were kind of upset. The Puritans, the Christians who came from England, they were kind of upset at the natives, at how they parented their kids. And you know why the Puritans were upset? Appalled, actually. They were surprised and kind of shocked. Because the natives didn't beat their kids. And to the Puritans, of course, you're supposed to beat your kids. If you spare the rod, you spoil the child. This is the ethic. So the idea of a culture that didn't beat their kids, they didn't understand that one. So, on the other hand, Native people carried their kids everywhere they went. So the kids were never put down. They were never left alone. They were not isolated in kindergartens. They were not left to cry if they were upset. They were picked up right away. In other words, they parented with absolute intuitive, instinctual, nurturing parenting practices. So, not only is it not true that Native people don't know how to parent, the fact is how they parented is superior to the way that most parenting happens in our culture. Because in our culture, we separate adults from kids, and it's still quite okay to spank a child. And if a child cries, we actually tell parents, don't pick them up, you're just going to spoil them. Just the opposite of what the kid actually needs. So if we want to understand how did we go from a culture that parented in the optimal way to something that we see all too often now in First Nations communities, where children are hurt or at least not getting their needs met, we can't understand it if we only look at that culture in isolation. We have to take a really close look at their relationship to the culture that took over here. And of course, I don't know that I have to tell this audience the history of what happened in this country, but I'll say more about it later. But what I am saying now is that if we want to understand why people are drinking, it's because they're in pain, and if we understand why they're in pain, we have to understand their life history. Their life history, not just as individuals, but also their life history as a society. And again, nothing that I'm saying is unique to First Nations peoples, but the suffering and the pain and the historical trauma is more concentrated in those communities than is anywhere else. And they didn't create their own trauma. That happened at the hands of other people. And now, who are we then, or who's anybody, to point fingers and say, you drink too much, you hurt your kid? We want to understand that. We really have to look at the history of this country and also the present of this country. Now, specifically when it comes to women drinking, if a guy drinks, well, that's too bad, but the kid is not going to end up with fetal alcohol syndrome. But as Natalie said, the woman's drinking is not separated from the man's drinking. In fact, very often, it's a relationship, right? Furthermore, there's an interesting statistic. Well, if you look at a whole range of diseases, autoimmune diseases, for example, autoimmune diseases where the immune system attacks the body itself. 120 years ago, there was no autoimmune disease in Native communities, none whatsoever. And now they have some of the world's highest rates of rheumatoid arthritis and autoimmune disease in general. 120 years ago, there was no diabetes in First Nations communities. But now, in some areas of Canada, we have some of the world's highest rates of diabetes. Can't be purely genetic. If it was, it should have happened a long time before. Something must have happened. Specifically, when you look at women, and women are at a higher risk for autoimmune disease, and also for like rheumatoid arthritis, and also for non-smoking related cancer. What's really going on is that, again, you can't isolate the women from the society that they live in. And I'm talking about women in general, not just Native women. In the 1940s, the ratio of multiple sclerosis was gender equal. So for every man diagnosed with multiple sclerosis, so was a woman. You know what the gender ratio now is in Canada? It's about 3 or 4 women to every man. Which right away tells you that multiple sclerosis, this disease of the nervous system, can't be genetic. Because if it was, it wouldn't have changed over 70 years, because genes don't change in a population over 70 years. It can't be the diet or the climate, because that hasn't changed more for one gender than the other. What's happened? What's happened, of course, I believe, and this is what one of my books is about, is that disease has everything to do with stress. And the stress on women has increased. Now, why has the stress on women increased when we have washing machines and dishwashers and all this kind of stuff? You know? And then the more gadgets we get, and the more, the labor-saving devices, the more busy and the more stressed we get. Because number one, women are still carrying out their roles as the emotional absorbers of their families. So that it's the woman who still absorbs the stress of the male. Automatically. It's just like an unspoken deal. Okay, kid, I'll marry you, says the guy, and your job is to absorb my stresses. And when you get tired of doing that, or too smart to do it, I'll find a younger woman who will do it again for me. You know? Basically, that's the deal. And the women go, yeah, that's great, fantastic, I'll do that. But in addition to that traditional role, women also have to play an economic role now. Because families need the income. And third, there's less support. There's less support because the community and the clan and the tribe that the Aboriginal people here had, and that people everywhere used to have, has been, by civilization and industrialization, completely destroyed. So people are much more isolated than they used to be. There's less social cohesion. There's less community. There's less contact, communication. There's less mutual support. So now we have more stress and less support. Well, no wonder then that women have more multiple sclerosis now. It's the same with drinking. So again, if a woman drinks, is that her individual problem? Or does that reflect, and this is true for men too, but I'm just talking about women right now, or does that reflect a history of pain, maybe trauma, a real discomfort with the self, and a lot of stress? And if it reflects all that, then it's no longer an individual problem, is it? Again, now we have to look at the whole social picture, which we as a society don't like very much to do. Now, if you look at addiction in general, there's been large-scale studies now. Well, I can tell you in the downtown east side, where my patients are addicted to heroin or cocaine or alcohol or a whole bunch of things at the same time, over a 12-year period, I didn't have a single female patient who had not been sexually abused as a child. Now, if you look at most women who are drinking enough to cause severe FASD in their kids, you're not going to find a single one who wasn't traumatized as a child. So what's actually happening is that in the woman's drinking, or the man's, but we're speaking about women now, the woman's drinking in adulthood, we actually see the impact of her own childhood. And if she was traumatized as a child, why was she traumatized? Because her parents had too much pain and trauma in their lives, and they acted it upon their kids. So when the woman's drinking, we're seeing the childhoods of her parents and of their parents before them. It's not an individual problem. It's a multi-generational problem. The pain is passed on until we somehow deal with it. And surely this conference is an attempt to somehow break that link of suffering, break that chain of suffering, separate the link so that the chain does not go on, enslaving generation upon generation. But that's what we're looking at. We're not looking at individual choices or failures. We're looking at multi-generational problems here. And that's not only my experience. That's also what the studies show. And this is where it gets a bit frustrating. because the studies that I'm telling you about, or will tell you about, are not controversial and they're not secret. I mean, they'll be published in major medical and psychological journals. But most practitioners don't know about them. Most practitioners don't know about them. Now, one set of studies in particular are called the Adverse Childhood Experiences Studies, ACE, or Adverse Childhood Experience. An adverse childhood experience is physical, sexual, or emotional abuse, the loss of a parent through death, through being jailed, or a rancorous divorce, violence in the family, addiction, mental illness in the family. You can actually go on the internet and download the ACE score and do your own and see where you're at. It'll explain a lot of what your experience in life has been about. Because the Adverse Childhood Experiences study clearly show, looking at tens of thousands of people, that for each of these events or set of events, the risk of drinking goes up exponentially, the risk of drug use goes up exponentially, the risk of obesity goes up exponentially, the risk of psychosis goes up exponentially, of mental illness in general, of criminality, of relationship problems, of diabetes, of strokes, of cancer, and a whole range of other problems. In other words, none of those things that we tend to think about as just a problem of the individual are problems of the individual. Even cancer is not a problem in the individual. Cancer reflects multi-generational history and childhood experience. Not that most physicians have any clue as to why that's the case. But in Canada, it's been shown that if you were abused as a child, your risk of cancer goes up 50%. In other words, your cancer is a manifestation of what happened to your grandparents. Because that's where you were abused. Because something happened in the family, or to the family. It's the same with alcoholism, same with drinking, same with all substance-related behaviors.
You know, listening to Dr. Gabor Mate, it really opened my eyes to how much we misunderstand addiction and trauma. I always thought that people struggling with these issues were just making bad choices, or maybe they just didn't have the willpower to fight it. He's saying that addiction, trauma, all those behaviors we see in people who are hurting, they're not just random or because someone is weak. They're actually coping mechanisms, ways people try to deal with deep, often unbearable emotional pain. And that's wild, right? Because it turns everything I thought I knew upside down. He talks about how we often think of addiction as just some poor decision making. But what if it's not about the substance or the behavior at all? What if it's about the pain behind it? Dr. Gabor Mate makes it clear that people don't just wake up one day and decide, hey, I'm going to ruin my life today. No, they're doing what they can to survive the mental and emotional turmoil they're going through. And that makes so much sense when you think about it. I mean, we've all had times when we just wanted to escape, to not feel what we're feeling. It's just that for some, that escape becomes a habit. And that habit becomes something way harder to break. What really struck me was when he explained how these behaviors are not just about the individual, but also about how society responds or doesn't respond to their pain. Like, wow, that's a perspective I hadn't considered. It's not just that someone's struggling, it's that we, as a society, aren't doing nearly enough to help. Instead, we judge. We say, why can't they just get it together? Without asking what got them to that point in the first place. And that's a tough pill to swallow because it means we're part of the problem. We're not seeing the full story. We're just seeing the surface. Dr. Gabor Mate really drives home that these issues are not just medical or psychological. They're societal. They're about how we treat people who are hurting and what kind of support we offer or fail to offer. And if we're not willing to look at the whole picture, to dig deep into why someone is in pain, we're just going to keep missing the mark. It's like putting a Band-Aid on a wound without cleaning it first. It might cover things up for a bit, but it doesn't heal the underlying issue. And that's what we need to start doing. Looking deeper, understanding more, and judging less.
So that to understand what happens to one generation, you have to understand what happened to the previous one. And then how that generation treated the next one. This stuff is passed on. And we don't pass it on deliberately, we just do. It's just how it is. We can't help it. Until we deal with it, we just pass it on. There's no way around it. Now, there's a psychiatrist in the States called Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, who is at Boston University, and he deals a lot with trauma. And he's actually proposing something here. He's saying that we have all these diagnoses, ADHD, and I'll be talking more about ADHD tomorrow. And I have it myself, by the way, which is why I like a lapel mic and I like to move around on stage. Oppositional defiant disorder, conduct disorders, Asperger's, Tourette's, all these things. And we think, we've diagnosed a kid with ADHD, now we've explained something. Or no, it's not ADHD, it's Asperger's. Well, that explains it. None of that explains anything. It only describes it. These diagnoses are not real entities in the real world. They're just stuff that we've put together to describe things. Now we think we've explained something. And FASD is the same thing. Now, what van der Kolk says is that instead of all these different diagnoses, there's only one diagnosis, which is what he calls developmental trauma disorder. And that simply means that human beings develop in interaction with the environment. Not a big surprise, is it? If you had a garden in which the plants weren't developing properly, and they weren't growing as well, or maybe they were deformed or somehow, you could have the option of going out there and yelling at them, like we do with kids. Grow up! What's wrong with you? Look at that, you're crooked. Straighten up already. Look at your posture. Or we could recognize that if those plants weren't developing properly, there's something wrong with the environment. We wouldn't be asking what's wrong with the plant. We'd be asking what conditions for development is that plant not receiving? Nutrition, soil, irrigation, sunlight. Well, now, we now know from decades of scientific research that the human personality and the human brain itself, the physiology of the human brain itself, develops in interaction with the environment. And for the right kind of development, you need the right kind of conditions. Now, I'll be speaking a lot more about that tomorrow in my workshop on ADHD and FASD. But to make a long story short, the essential condition for the proper development of brain circuits that govern our behavior and our emotional life. So brain circuits that govern our capacity to regulate our impulses so that we're not acting out all the time. Brain circuits that regulate our capacity to balance ourselves emotionally so we don't get too upset when something happens, so we can handle it. Brain circuits that handle our capacity to respond to stress. And other important to pay attention. All these important brain circuits need the right environment. And the essential condition is a non-stress, supportive parenting environment. Now if we look at society as a whole, and we see all these kids who are diagnosed with oppositionality, conduct disorders, ADHD, Tourette's, Asperger's, autism, all that, they all have stuff in common. What they have in common is poor impulse control, poor emotional self-regulation. So when they get upset, they show tantrums. They can't stop themselves. Poor social cues. They can't read social cues very well. In other words, all the things that FASD kids don't have either. And in all these other cases, we're not saying it's because the mother drank too much, because the mother didn't drink. What happened was that those children were born to stressed parents under stressed circumstances. And in those conditions, the brain didn't develop properly. They couldn't develop properly. Now, if you look at FASD kids, what do we see? Not only do we see that the mothers may have drunk excessively during pregnancy. But if we ask, why did those women drink? Well, we've already answered that. It's because the woman was in pain emotionally and she needed to soothe the pain with the drink. In other words, she's a stressed woman. She has a lifelong history of distress. And she's in a distressful situation right now. Maybe she's in a relationship where she's being beaten. Maybe she's in a relationship where she's not being supported. Maybe she's living with an alcoholic male. Maybe she's all isolated. In other words, she's very, very stressed. But I can tell you already, and I'll say much more about it tomorrow, stress on a woman during pregnancy has an impact on the developing nervous system of the child, physiologically. So studies have shown that women who are stressed during pregnancy, their kids will have behavioral problems at age 3 or 4. Animals who are stressed during pregnancy, their offspring will be more likely to use cocaine and alcohol as adults. Much more evidence which I'll present tomorrow. But what's obvious here and what's evident is that any woman who drinks is by definition a stressed woman. Not only that, I'll say more about this tomorrow, but again, stress in the first few years of life interferes with the development of the child's brain also. Now, any child born into a family where there's drinking in the family is born into a stress situation by definition. How do we know what is the effect of stress on the developing brain and what is the effect of alcohol? Well, in the case of the kids who've got the facial markings or the brain scan findings or the heart difficulty, heart abnormalities, and so on, caused by the toxin, alcohol, well, you can clearly say that's the alcohol. But what about the many kids with the fetal alcohol spectrum disorder who don't have any of the physical markings at all? Can we say for sure that it's all because of the alcohol? Or is a lot of it perhaps due to the stress on the parenting environment? Now here's the good news though. The good news is the part that's due to the stress is actually reversible. Those brain circuits can be rewired in the child. There's something called neuroplasticity, which is the capacity of the brain to develop new circuits even later on in life. And that capacity is with us all our lives. And we know this from animal studies and human experience, that the brain can rewire. We can see this on brain scans. We can see it on autopsies. So if you give people the right conditions, in fact, you know something? Even those infants who are born with physical brain damage can develop new circuits later on in life. Studies in California have shown this. You take rats and you deliberately brain damage them at birth, but then you expose them to an environment that's supportive and nourishing, they'll actually do a whole lot better. You can take mice where you've knocked out one of their genes that supports learning, but if you give them the right environment, you'd never know that that gene wasn't active in them. They learn just as well as other mice. In other words, there's much more capacity for repair and new development and new functions to arise in the human brain than we actually often credit. But what does that depend on? Well, just like the plant, it depends on the environment. So the key question is, how do we give kids the right kind of environment? And never mind giving up on anybody, because you never know how much development they're capable of until you give them a right environment. Now, the right environment, of course, involves a lot of loving and nurturing. It does not involve fancy techniques, necessarily. It does not involve a whole lot of technology. It involves lots of unconditional, loving attention. And that's what this dog did for this kid. And the point that they make in this article, and this dog is the only creature in that boy's life who does not react negatively when the kid acts out. In fact, he's trained to get in there, and even he can pick up when the kid is going to act out. He senses it. and gets in there and tries to cheer the kid up. And, it's amazing. And as the article points out, that when the human brain can relax, then it can learn. So that for learning, you have to have a sense of comfort and safety. And when you've got your emotional needs met, and you're loved and you're accepted, then your brain can relax and it can actually take on the task of learning, acquiring new information, and incorporating that new information. So even this heavily, heavily challenged little boy, who is severely physically affected by the alcohol, even in him, the presence of the dog has meant a completely new lease on life. And he'll always be challenged, but there's capacities in him that nobody would ever known that he had if this dog hadn't been brought into his life, a specially trained dog, by the way. But what the dog can provide is, of course, what ideally human beings could also provide if we weren't screwed up, all of us, which is this unconditional loving acceptance and the sense of intuitive connection. So that's what these kids need. That's also what the women need who drink. Because again, their drinking is no accident. And that causes me, finally, to look at the larger picture again. And that larger picture, again, is Canadian society. Now, a few years ago, our current Prime Minister apologized for the residential schools. I think I've heard everything in the downtown east side and doing my travels, but then something happens and I think, this is impossible. So let me tell you a little story. So last year, about a year ago, I was working with one of the native bands in BC, the Seashell Band. And I was working with a Peruvian plant called ayahuasca, which is a healing plant, one of these healing plants. It's a hallucinogen. Ooh, it gives you visions. Healing visions. And we had a Peruvian shaman working with us, and I was working with supporting that work. And of course, we were dealing with people who are addicted, women who are heavily into cocaine, the men who are into alcohol, or both, or women, and just a heavily addicted group of people. And I initiated this discussion about, look, well, let's go, what happened to you in life? So one woman in her 50s told me that in a residential school, when she was 4 years old, and some of you would have heard these stories, but to me it was a shock. I thought I'd heard everything. I hadn't. When she spoke her native language, you know what they did? The nuns stuck a pin in her tongue to give her pain so as to make her forget her language. Now, of course, that means she had to sit there the whole hour. Because if she put her tongue back in her mouth, she would cut her lips or the inside of her mouth. This happened in this province, in this country, within the lifetime of many people in this room. And then we talk about drunken Indians. Then we say, why are they doing this to their kids? And so when this apology came from Mr. Harper, well, that was a good thing. At least they acknowledged what happened. But it's not enough. In fact, I rather thought that the apology was meaningless. The reason it was meaningless is because it's not enough to apologize for something if you're going to keep doing the same thing. Now, it's not that we have residential schools in this country anymore. No, that we don't. So we can safely apologize for that. But we haven't apologized for yet is the destruction of people's ways of life, the destruction of the attempted, not successful, thank God, but the attempted destruction of their culture and the robbery of their resources. And why we haven't apologized for that? Because we're still doing it. Look right now, this northern pipeline that they want to build. The native communities across the north are lining up to oppose it, to express their concerns for their children, for the possible toxic effect, for the destruction, further destruction of their ways of life. And our government says that these people who are saying those things are just foreign agitators. But what does it mean to apologize when you're still going to rob people of what belongs to them? And when you continue to make their lives miserable? Then what do we expect except more addiction? And what's our government's response to that? To the addiction problem and to the fact that people are going to drink and break the law? It's to spend billions of dollars more in jails. So the same government that doesn't have the money for social services and wants to raise the rage for old age pensions because, to save money. What we do have money for is to build more jails and to keep people in jail longer by toughening up the criminal code. And who's going to end up in those jails? Let me read you a paragraph from my book on addiction. Detective Sergeant Paul Gillespie, head of Toronto's sex crimes unit, rescued children from the purveyors of internet pornography. That's what he did. He rescued these kids that were being abused on the internet. As the Globe and Mail reported on his retirement from police work, 6 years at that job had not inured him to the horrors that he witnessed. Paul Gillespie still can't get used to the sounds of crying and pain, says the Globe article, and the graphic videos of children being raped and molested that he has seen all too often on the web. It's beyond horrible to listen to the soundtracks of these movies, said Canada's best-known child porn cop. But it is the silent images of desolate children that tear most at his heart. They're not screaming, just accepting, he said, of the infants captured in his pictures. They have dead eyes. You can tell that their spirit is broken. That's their life. He's talking about 2-year-olds. Those 2-year-olds are going to end up drinking and using drugs. And if that same policeman, think about this one, if that same policeman, instead of quitting the force, transferred to the drug squad, who do you think he'd be chasing in the streets? Those children that he didn't rescue. Because they're the ones who become the addicts. They're the ones who become the alcoholics. So here we have the paradox of we try to protect and rescue kids from trauma if we can. And if we can't, we put them in jail 20 years later. And this is what we call a civilized country. This is what we call the best country in the world to live in. For who? Not for the vulnerable. Not for the people that suffer the multi-generational trauma of what this history, our history, has imposed on them. Well, there's good news in all this. The good news is that children's brains are malleable and plastic, even adults' brains, so that if we actually can create the conditions for the healthy development, that development will take place. And a lot more kids can do a whole lot better if we get all that. If we don't just dismiss them as this diagnosis and that diagnosis, and that means it's hopeless. Because none of these conditions are written in stone, and even as much about FASD that's reversible. I'm not dismissing here the toxic effect of alcohol. I'm just saying there's a lot there besides that, and that's what Natalie said in the first place, that there's a lot of continuity between these conditions and a lot of similarity, and so that the approach has to be also similar, which is to recognize that underlying all of them, including fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, there's a lot of childhood stress and trauma, multi-generational, and if we go to work on supporting these families and helping these families and helping these children, and in our schools and kindergartens and institutions, and especially if we ever had the wisdom to stop spending the money in the utterly inhumane and non-productive and from every angle useless, worse than useless, criminalization of people who use substances because they're too much in pain, well, we could actually get somewhere. And finally, when I look at the qualities or the teachings of traditional cultures around the world, whether in Peru or in North America or in Canada or in BC, what do we find? We see a recognition of the interconnection of things. We see the importance of connection to the land, of being grounded. We see the importance of nature. We see forgiveness.
Then, Dr. Gabor Mate gets into this whole idea of generational trauma, and honestly, it's something I hadn't thought much about before. He explains that trauma isn't just a one-time thing. It can be passed down from one generation to the next. Like, if your parents or grandparents experience severe trauma, that can affect how they parent, how they interact with you, and even how you understand the world. And when he said that, it really clicked for me. It's not just about the person in front of us, it's about all the experiences that led up to this moment. It's kind of mind-blowing when you think about it. He's basically saying that the pain we carry isn't always just ours. It's often inherited. And if it's not dealt with, it just keeps getting passed down. That means a lot of the struggles we see, whether it's addiction, mental health issues, or he talks about the need for compassion, for understanding, for really seeing people beyond their behaviors. And that's something we can all do, right? We can all choose to be a little more compassionate, a little more understanding. And that doesn't just help the person who's struggling, it helps us too. It helps us build a more supportive, more empathetic community. And it's not just about feeling sorry for people. Dr. Gabor Mate makes it clear that it's about taking real action. It's about changing the way we think, the way we treat each other. It's about recognizing that if we want to help people heal, we have to create environments that are safe, supportive, and nurturing. We have to stop judging people for their pain and start asking how we can help them heal from it. And that's such a powerful shift in perspective. It's not about blame or shame. It's about understanding and healing.
My name is Bobby. I'm 34. I wanted to share my story because there's a huge stigma surrounding FAS, the causes and effects. I was about 16 or 17. I was actually kind of relieved a little bit, actually. Well, growing up, I knew there was something different about me because I was in speech therapy when I was like 5 because I couldn't speak properly. I couldn't pronounce my own name. I was in toy therapy because I couldn't play with toys. And then there was like, family counseling and stuff like that. So I knew something was different. I couldn't put my finger on it. And that's when my dad told me, it made a lot of sense. And, I accepted it. Then I stopped being so hard on myself after a while because then I realized that, even though I never used it as a crutch and I never used it as an excuse, I also knew that I had different struggles. So I couldn't be so hard on myself when it came to my learning. And I knew that as long as I did the best that I could do, that was good enough. Just because I look normal and talk normal, it's still a disability. So if you have a child or someone with FASD or any other disability, the only thing you can do is not give up on them. There is hope.
We see witnessing of one another's pain. We see listening. We see inclusion. We see restorative justice. We see ceremony. We see communal chanting and the creation of communal spaces. In other words, all the qualities necessary for healing are actually present in traditional teachings. So I think that for us to help heal the ones who most need it, but also for us to heal as a society, we need to drop the arrogance that science somehow will give us the answers. That realize that the answers have been here with us all along. We just haven't paid attention to them. And if we did, our whole society would be much more happy and much more humane. Thank you. If I could live my life over again, I'd live it very differently. You know, if I could parent them again, I'd not be the same person. Because although I didn't have an alcohol or any substance addiction, I was a workaholic. And I wasn't around for my kids emotionally. And you don't have to have alcohol or a substance to be addicted to in order to hurt your kids. All you have to do is to be emotionally absent. So this issue of parental guilt and caregiver guilt, I mean, I deal with it. Because my kids got issues. As adults, they have issues. And those issues, I know, would not be there had I been a different parent. That's just the reality. That's how it is. But if I look at it objectively, did I choose to be that way, or is there something driving me that I wasn't aware of? Maybe I had some pain that I was trying to drown through my work. Maybe I felt not wanted in this world because of stuff that happened to me early in life, and then my way of compensating was to make myself a really busy doctor. So people would then want my services. They didn't want me, at least they want my services. So I did that. But as a result, my kids didn't get the attention they needed. Now, guilt. Was I guilty of anything? No, I did my best given who I was, but that's who I was. That's the first point. The second point is that, well, the second point is simply that people do their best. And we're human beings. And so, you know, we have all this love and compassion in our hearts, but sometimes we don't project that. Sometimes we project impatience or frustration or anger or even rejection. And we don't mean to. That's not our intention. It's just how we're wired. Not that we're born that way, but that's how we became wired. So until we overcome our wiring, until we overcome our childhood programming, we're still going to make mistakes, and we're still going to do stuff that's going to even hurt the people that we're actually trying to help. You might as well accept that. That's how it is. It's not your personal problem. It's not your fault. It's not individual to you. It's not personal to you. That's just who we are as human beings. So if you're going to feel guilt, well, just realize that you're a human being. And that's where all this comes from. And the fact is that whoever is asking this question, I have no doubt that you're doing your best at any given moment. But your best is limited by who you are, by your own programming and all the stuff that's happened to you, and by the stresses that you're under right now. So cut yourself some slack here. And furthermore, there's a worse thing about guilt, which is that when we look at our kids and we feel guilty, we're actually not seeing their possibilities. We're only seeing their problems. And for parents, that's very tempting. When I look at my kids, I see their problems. Other people look at them, what wonderful kids you got, you know? Who are you talking about? But as parents and caregivers, we tend to see the problems because it's our job to deal with them, and also we tend to see our responsibility. We don't see the possibility. So, and there's a final thing I'd say about guilt, which is that whoever feels guilty today, as a caregiver, that guilt is not you. You felt guilty before your child ever came into the world. The guilt is just yours. And most of the time we feel guilty, it's because as children we learn to feel guilty because we failed at the most important thing that we took on, which is impossible. And we feel guilty because our parents were not happy. And the child can only take that personally. So if my parents are not happy, the kid can only say, well, something's wrong with me, so it's my fault. So your guilt in the present has got nothing to do with your child. It has to do with your parents. And you know what? You never could make them happy because it wasn't your job. Only they could make themselves happy, and if they couldn't do that, you couldn't do it for them. But as a result, you develop this guilt of failure, and you're responsible. And now you're projecting that guilt onto your child, of course, or your relationship with your child. So for all these reasons, Notice the guilt, just say hello to it, but don't pay attention to it. It's not a particularly smart thing, guilt. Okay? Okay, next question. Sure. It's because your question is a good one and a very common one, and it's an important one. It also contains a fallacy. You said when you look at two kids who were raised by the same parents, there's no two kids who were ever raised by the same two parents. Okay? No two children ever the same two parents. Now let me give you an example for my family, which I talk about in my book Scattered Minds. Okay? Just to give you an illustration of it. So I was born in Budapest, Hungary, 1944. Jewish parents, Second World War, Nazi occupation. Can you imagine what first year I had? Can you imagine the stresses my mother was under? Her parents were killed in Auschwitz. My father, her husband, my father was away in forced labor. She didn't know if he was dead or alive. That was my first year. My next brother was born in 1946. My father had come back. It was peacetime. It was a time of optimism, rebuilding. My third brother, or the third of us brothers, was born, his name is not Mate, his name is Mate. Because he was born in Canada. None of this European stuff. George Mate, who's now 50, I don't know, he was born in 58, so however that makes him, 54 years old this year. He's got a tattoo on his shoulder, which he put on just this year as a 53-year-old. And it's got the Vancouver Canucks logo. And I said, George, tell me this is just a paint-on job. He said, no, it's real, he says, and when we win the cup, the cup is going on the other arm. But we're still waiting for that tattoo. But he was born in 58 in Canada to a mother who was then 39, a father who was 48, new immigrants in Canada, not speaking the language, trying to make their life in a new culture, struggling economically. Do you think that three brothers had the same parents? Can you see that they didn't? It's the same with all other kids, okay? So children are never born to the same parents because the parents are at a different stage of their relationship, a different stage of their life, different stresses. And not only that, each kid evokes something different from a parent. So even though I love my kids the same, and I might be fair in terms of what kind of goods I give them or what kind of rules I set down for them and all that, but emotionally I react to them differently because they trigger a different part of me because they're different people. So they don't experience me as the same at all. And furthermore, even if I could be the same person to them, which I can't be, even if I could be the same person, which I can't be, they would experience me differently because they have different sensibilities. I see you've got ADD, you're in a big hurry to get out of that. Neither can I. So we can just talk to each other, okay? Okay, so the third point is you got to look after yourself. You got to take responsibility for your own ADD, okay? I highly recommend, if you haven't already, that you either read my book, Scattered Minds, or you download the audio version and listen to it if you can't read. If you can't focus that long to read, because it'll give you a totally different take on the condition than you've ever heard from anybody else. It'll explain to you what it's actually about, which goes back to your childhood stresses, and that there's things you can do for yourself in the present to deal with it.
Okay.
So that the short answer is, don't try and explain things to her. Let her be a kid, so listen to her and spend time with her. And thirdly, as best you can, take responsibility for your own stuff, and that'll create an atmosphere where your kids could be more at ease as well.
Okay.
Okay?
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Dr. Gabor Mate doesn't just talk about the struggles of mothers facing addiction. He also dives deep into what fetal alcohol spectrum disorders, or FASD, really mean for babies. And honestly, it's heartbreaking. When we think about the impact of alcohol on a developing baby, we're talking about something so much more than just a medical diagnosis. FASD can cause a range of serious physical and cognitive issues, from brain damage to heart defects, and even distinctive facial features. Imagine A tiny life that's already facing a steep uphill battle before they've even taken their first breath. These babies, born into a world already stacked against them, often struggle with learning difficulties, behavioral problems, and a host of other challenges that can last a lifetime. And it's not just the physical symptoms. There's a deep, often invisible impact on their emotional and social development. They might find it harder to connect with others, to understand social cues, or to manage their impulses and emotions. It's like they're set up to face the world with fewer tools than everyone else. And that's not fair. But here's the thing. Dr. Gabor Mate makes it clear that these outcomes aren't just about the alcohol. Yes, prenatal exposure to alcohol can be devastating, but the bigger picture involves how society responds to these children and their mothers. It's about whether we choose to offer support and understanding or judgment and neglect. These kids don't just need medical care. They need a community that recognizes their challenges and is willing to help them grow beyond them. They need love, stability, and a chance to heal, which can make all the difference in how they navigate the world. Dr. Gabor Mate's message is a powerful reminder that FASD is more than just a label. It's a call to action for all of us to do better for these children and their families. It's about looking beyond the symptoms and understanding the full scope of what these babies are facing. And it starts with empathy, support, and a willingness to be part of the solution.
All right, going once. One more question, yeah?
I want to know your perspective on Ritalin.
Ritalin?
Ritalin, they use it to treat.
My perspective on Ritalin? Well, here's the thing. So I've taken it myself. Now, Ritalin didn't affect me very well. It made me depressed. It made me focused, but depressed. But then I took, but that's okay. That wasn't the right medication for me. It might be for somebody else. The stimulants in the short term certainly help people focus better, and they can reduce the impulse problems. That's true in the short term. In the long term, they don't do a whole lot. Because all they are is they're temporary agents that change the brain chemistry of the child as long as they're in the system. Now, if we understand ADD to be not a disease that the child inherits, which it isn't, contrary to all the opinion otherwise, the scientific proof for that is zero, if you look at it properly. If you understand that ADD, and I'll say much more about this tomorrow, is a problem of development, because the conditions weren't right, therefore, in children who are especially are predisposed, if the conditions aren't right, you're going to get a certain, failure of development, but that the long-term solution is development itself, then the question we'd be asking is not how do we control symptoms in the short term, but how do we promote development in the long term. So having said that, I'm not against medications, but I'm certainly against what's happening with the medications. The number of prescriptions for stimulants in Canada in the last 5 years has gone up 43%. Most of the time that a child is diagnosed, all that happens is that they get a prescription. Nobody talks to the parents about developmental issues, but we don't look at it that way. A few short rules. No kid should be forced to take any kind of medication, because not just because it's an invasion of their bodies, but also because no child should get the impression that the only way they're acceptable to adults is if they're medicated. That's not a message we should be conveying to any child. No child should be taking medications that give them bad side effects, like stomach aches or anxiety or headaches or poor sleep or loss of appetite. And I've seen kids on medications for a long time with all those side effects. Because what we're looking at is not the child's experience, but the child's behavior. Well, he's behaving better, it's good for him. Meanwhile, the child is suffering. Now, some children can take the medication beautifully with no side effects, with only positive effects. That's great. In the right dose, in the right hands, that's a good thing. But whether we give medication or not, we should not think it's the answer. It's not the answer. It's just temporary symptom control. The answer is still in development. That's my take on those medications. And the schools, by the way, should never make it a condition that the child takes medications for them to go to school. If we're in a, and I speak to you as a former high school teacher, which I decided was way too stressful, so I went to medical school instead. If we're having a lot of kids in our society now that are being diagnosed with this or that disorder, then the schools should be places where that can be handled. And the teachers need training. And we need to have special ed teachers in there. We need to have lots of supports. And that's where the money should be going, not on computers, you know. And so that the child should be able to go to school exactly the way he is, and the school should have provisions and programs and support so that the child can be well taken care of in that setting. Now, you know, again, if medications are appropriate, if the child accepts them, and if they help, I'm not against them.
As Dr. Gabor Mate continues, he touches on something that really brings it all together. The idea that healing isn't just about fixing what's broken, it's about creating new possibilities. He talks about something called neuroplasticity, which is basically the brain's ability to form new connections and pathways, even after trauma or damage. And that's huge. It means that no matter how deep the pain, no matter how long someone has struggled, there's always a chance for change, for growth, for healing. That's a message of hope that's really needed, especially when we're talking about heavy stuff like addiction and trauma. Because it's easy to feel like things are set in stone, like there's no way out. But Dr. Gabor Mate is saying that's not true. Our brains, our bodies, our minds, they're all capable of change. We're not stuck in our pain. We're not doomed by our past. There's always room for new growth, new understanding, new ways of being. He's also quick to point out that this doesn't mean it's easy. Healing takes work, and it takes the right environment. It takes people who are willing to listen, to support, to understand. And that's where we come in. You know, we all have a role to play in creating those environments, whether it's in our families, our communities, or our workplaces. We can all contribute to making the world a more compassionate place. Dr. Gabor Mate really emphasizes that healing is possible for everyone, but it requires us to change our approach. It's not just about focusing on symptoms or behaviors. It's about understanding the root causes, the pain behind the pain. And it's about providing the support and love that everyone needs to heal. It's a call to action for all of us to be part of the solution.
Dr. Gabor Mate, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. What I'm really grateful about is that you put it into context also about two societies of a larger society, settler society, Canadian society, as well as Indigenous society. And when we think about it, a lot of the language you're using speaks a lot to colonization and the impacts it has on peoples. And we've often addressed that not only were Indigenous peoples colonized and assimilated, and but also settler society is also colonized to become a Canadian, to to no longer be from a distinct society from other parts of the world, but to become part of this society. So it did produce a great deal of shame, and when I think about decolonization, it kind of gets muddled up because we're working within the confines of colonial structure. We're working in organizations, we're working in townships, regions, we're working in that kind of a framework. And here in Wet'suwet'en society, we had been shown the way for generations, and that was disrupted with residential schools and foster care systems. At present, we see the numbers of children in care this year alone supersedes the number of children that had attended residential school in all of residential school history across Canada.
Really?
And so what we're looking at is this other issue of what you also framed the context of our resources as peoples. And it's a very difficult concept because we abided by natural laws, and that did not say that we had ownership of nature. It said that we had a relationship with it. And what we're seeing too is that settler society demands more and more and more of what they consider resources to help us pay for our pain and healing. And we then jostle position and fill those positions and spend that money, meanwhile still being disenfranchised from the land and from where we truly belong, especially from our natural laws. So I guess my question is also about trauma-related incidences in all of mainstream society, whether it's a settler society or indigenous society. And the question is more for the room, like how we can see ourselves, kind of remove ourselves from that colonial construct and include ourselves in nature and include ourselves in natural law, because that's where all of our people have come from before. So what we have a major challenge in doing all of this is finding that time. You've described indigenous societies and how close they were to their children. And what we see today is every generation in our families is separated throughout most of the week. And our social capital is diminished because society says, hey, configure yourselves differently so you can produce, so you can continue to take from nature and give to us, and we'll give you money in return, and you can spend it on your communities and keep working in that framework. And our question has to be about when do we let it all go and really, really do some real groundwork, some real grassroots work, and pressure settler governments to change and amend their laws so that they also reflect natural law, because that's where our conflicts are arising. Is we're in the way as indigenous societies. It's more profitable for a country to pay into maintaining poverty the way it is now, rather than spending even half that amount to eradicate poverty. So that's our conflict right now is where do we begin? When do we let this all go and stop trying to fit roles that don't belong to us? They're not of our design. If we're really going to combat racism, violence, and addiction and its effects on our peoples, we really need to have a really good look at our week-long activities, how much time we have with all of our generations present, and how they can decolonize, and what does that mean for a settler society to decolonize? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. You didn't so much ask a question as you threw out a challenge, and not to me, but I mean to all of us, and also, of course, you made a very powerful statement. So I won't reiterate what you said because it doesn't need for me to add anything to it. I just make a couple of quick points. You talked about the trauma throughout society, in the rest of society, as opposed to just the First Nation groups. Well, here's this American psychiatrist that I've quoted earlier, and he said, people with childhood histories of trauma, abuse, and neglect make up almost the entire criminal justice population in the United States. Just about every single person in jail in this country or in the US is there because of childhood trauma or neglect. So it's a general problem. It's not restricted. It's a problem of this society. And my next book, which I hope to write this fall, is tentatively entitled Toxic Culture, How Materialistic Society Makes Us Sick. Okay? Encompassing some of the ideas that you expressed. The second point is that what you said about how we spend our time and away from our kids, and then, this book, I don't know if you're familiar with it, I co-wrote it. It's not my work, it's the work of a friend of mine, a wonderful psychologist, Gordon Neufeld, who he's probably been up here, has he not? Yeah, he's been here, yeah. So Gordon and I wrote this book together, and he talks about how we've lost the connection with our kids because of all the factors that you talked about. And the consequence of that is that kids whose brains have to connect to somebody, if the adults are not around, they'll connect to other kids. And so now for the first time in history, you've got kids being the major influence on each other's development. I'll say much more about that tomorrow, but that's a direct consequence of the factors you described. And that book is called Hold On to Your Kids, and it's a major problem throughout society. So kids are meant to be initiated into the adult world by elders and adults, and now they're being initiated into the world by peers. And of course, when it comes to drug use specifically, the commonest context for beginning drug use is in the peer group. And all that's because kids have lost their adult attachments, and they lost their adult attachments because economically we've broken up those family and village and neighborhood structures that held kids safe in a context of adult relationships.
What's really compelling about Dr. Gabor Mate's talk is how he connects all of this to the bigger picture of society. He doesn't just stop at individual pain. He looks at how societal factors play a huge role in shaping our experiences. He talks about how our culture often fails to support those who are most vulnerable: children, the elderly, the addicted, the mentally ill, and how this failure only deepens the wounds people carry. He explains that many of our societal structures are not built to foster healing, but rather to maintain the status quo. It's a harsh truth, but one that needs to be faced. When people are in pain and reach out for help, what do they often find? Judgment, stigma, a lack of resources. Dr. Gabor Mate points out that we often isolate the very people who need connection the most, pushing them further into their suffering instead of offering a hand. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Dr. Gabor Mate argues that the way we respond to these individuals often reflects our discomfort with our own pain. It's easier to judge someone else than to confront our own fears and insecurities. This societal unwillingness to face pain head-on contributes to a cycle where trauma is perpetuated rather than healed. He challenges us to change this, to create a society that is more nurturing, more understanding, and more willing to engage with the hard stuff. That means not only offering better support systems, but also changing our attitudes and beliefs about what it means to be in pain. It's about moving from a place of judgment to one of empathy. It's about seeing people as whole, even when they're struggling. Dr. Gabor Mate also touches on the idea of interconnectedness, and this is something that really resonated with me. He talks about how nothing happens in isolation. Every action, every event, every trauma is connected to something larger. When someone is struggling, it's not just about their individual experience, it's about how their experience fits into a larger context of family, community, and society. He gives examples of how historical traumas, like colonization and systemic racism, continue to impact communities today. These aren't just abstract concepts, they're real, tangible forces that shape people's lives. Dr. Gabor Mate argues that if we want to help people heal, we have to understand these connections. We have to see how the past affects the present, and how individual pain is often a reflection of broader social issues. This idea of interconnectedness also extends to the solutions we need to pursue. Dr. Gabor Mate suggests that we can't just focus on one aspect of healing and expect it to be enough. We need a holistic approach that addresses all the different factors that contribute to someone's pain. That means providing not just medical care, but also social support, community connection, and opportunities for growth and development. And he's right, because when we only focus on one part of the problem, we're missing out on the bigger picture. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with only half the pieces. If we want to create real change, we need to look at the whole system and see how everything fits together. Only then can we start to make meaningful progress toward healing.
Absolutely. And of course, if you look at countries like Greece right now, because of the economic crisis that the kind bankers of Europe have thrust upon Greece, now there's more suicides in Greece in the last half year and more alcoholism. And that means there'll be more kids born with fetal alcohol problem. And in the Soviet Union, of course, there's been a tremendous rise in alcoholism for economic, social reasons, and for reasons of dislocation and disruption of communities that we've talked about. Of course, you're going to do the same thing, see the same thing over there. The reason I keep or emphasize the First Nations connection is obviously because of this area and this country. And but that doesn't make it a uniquely First Nation problem. You're quite right, and they just happen to be manifesting it more tragically, perhaps statistically, than other segments of the population. But it's a human problem. It's a human problem, which might be a good note to end this conversation on, that we're dealing with a human problem here, and it's something that can't be differentiated into, as Natalie said in the beginning, into race or class or so on. It's a human problem. It's a problem of human pain and human suffering, and therefore the solution has to be humanity.
They're all capable of change. We're not stuck in our pain. We're not doomed by our past. There's always room for new growth, new understanding, new ways of being. He's also quick to point out that this doesn't mean it's easy. Healing takes work, and it takes the right environment. It takes people who are willing to listen, to support, to understand. And that's where we come in. You know, we all have a role to play in creating those environments. Whether it's in our families, our communities, or our workplaces, we can all contribute to making the world a more compassionate place. Dr. Gabor Mate really emphasizes that healing is possible for everyone, but it requires us to change our approach. It's not just about focusing on symptoms or behaviors, it's about understanding the root causes, the pain behind the pain. And it's about providing the support and love that everyone needs to heal. It's a call to action for all of us to be part of the solution. What's really compelling about Dr. Gabor Mate's talk is how he connects all of this to the bigger picture of society. He doesn't just stop at individual pain. He looks at how societal factors play a huge role in shaping our experiences. He talks about how our culture often fails to support those who are most vulnerable: children, the elderly, the addicted, the mentally ill, and how this failure only deepens the wounds people carry. He explains that many of our societal structures are not built to foster healing, but rather to maintain the status quo. It's a harsh truth, but one that needs to be faced. When people are in pain and reach out for help, what do they often find? Judgment, stigma, a lack of resources. Dr. Gabor Mate points out that we often isolate the very people who need connection the most, pushing them further into their suffering instead of offering a hand. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Dr. Gabor Mate argues that the way we respond to these individuals often reflects our discomfort with our own pain. It's easier to judge someone else than to confront our own fears and insecurities. This societal unwillingness to face pain head-on contributes to a cycle where trauma is perpetuated rather than healed. He challenges us to change this, to create a society that is more nurturing, more understanding, and more willing to engage with the hard stuff. That means not only offering better support systems, but also changing our attitudes and beliefs about what it means to be in pain. It's about moving from a place of judgment to one of empathy. It's about seeing people as whole, even when they're struggling. Dr. Gabor Mate also touches on the idea of interconnectedness, and this is something that really resonated with me. He talks about how nothing happens in isolation. Every action, every event, every trauma is connected to something larger. When someone is struggling, it's not just about their individual experience, it's about how their experience fits into a larger context of family, community, and society. He gives examples of how historical traumas, like colonization and systemic racism, continue to impact communities today. These aren't just abstract concepts, they're real, tangible forces that shape people's lives. Dr. Gabor Mate argues that if we want to help people heal, we have to understand these connections. We have to see how the past affects the present, and how individual pain is often a reflection of broader social issues. This idea of interconnectedness also extends to the solutions we need to pursue. Dr. Gabor Mate suggests that we can't just focus on one aspect of healing and expect it to be enough. We need a holistic approach that addresses all the different factors that contribute to someone's pain. That means providing not just medical care, but also social support, community connection, and opportunities for growth and development. And he's right, because when we only focus on one part of the problem, we're missing out on the bigger picture. It's like trying to solve a puzzle with only half the pieces. If we want to create real change, we need to look at the whole system and see how everything fits together. Only then can we start to make meaningful progress toward healing. Finally, Dr. Gabor Mate wraps up with a powerful call to action. He's not just talking about ideas in the abstract, he's challenging us to take these insights and turn them into action. He's saying, look, we can't just talk about these things. We have to do something about them. We have to change the way we think, the way we act, the way we treat each other. And that's a big challenge, but it's one that we have to take seriously. Because if we don't, nothing's going to change. He talks about how we have the power to make a difference, but we have to be willing to use it. We can't just sit back and hope that things will get better on their own. We have to be the ones to make it happen. And that's inspiring because it shows that we have control, that we have the ability to make things better. We just have to be willing to take the first step. And that's really the takeaway, isn't it? That we have the power to make things better, but we have to be willing to act. We have to be willing to make the changes that need to be made, even when it's hard, even when it's uncomfortable, because that's the only way things are going to get better. It's not going to happen on its own. It's up to us. Dr. Gabor Mate is really pushing us to see that we have a role to play in all of this, that we're not just bystanders, but active participants. And that's a powerful message because it means that we have the power to make a difference. We just have to be willing to use it. And that's something we can all do in our own ways, in our own lives. We can all make a difference if we're willing to try. So, yeah, what a ride. This guy's calling for a total rethink, and I'm here for it. We need to have more conversations like this. And more importantly, we need to start acting on them because at the end of the day, people's lives are at stake. Kids' lives are at stake. And that's no small thing.